Aimee and I had always wondered what it would be like to wake up one day, quit our jobs, and just drive. Perhaps, as the late Merle Haggard once put it, we'd be turned loose somewhere in the middle of Montana. Most people never make it past the point of wondering. But we're not like most people, so one summer, we did just that. We spent the better part of 6 months leading up to our departure tinkering with our newly acquired 1985 Volkswagen camper van, which Aimee had appropriately dubbed Bullwinkle. The anxiety of knowing that despite our best efforts, our 30-year-old home on wheels could, at any moment, leave us stranded, or worse, with an insurmountable list of repair expenses, was palpable. But we realized that at some point, we just had to say screw it and take the plunge. After all, it wouldn't be much of an adventure without the imminent threat of complete and utter disaster. We spent the first 600 miles to West Virginia listening intently to every bump and creak the van made. On day 2, just as we were beginning to let our guard down, things began to take a turn for the worse. A loud whining sound was radiating from underneath the van. We knew all too well what that sound meant, because just 2 weeks earlier it had preceded a breakdown when our old fuel pump had finally given out. That time we were only a short tow from home. Now, we were in the middle of the Appalachian Mountains, miles upon miles from anything familiar. We decided to shoot for North Carolina in hopes of making it to Aimee's brother's place in Reedsville before the engine stopped running. We kept our eyes focused on the horizon for the next 10 hours, desperately awaiting the sight of familiar faces. We pulled in as the sun was setting, drenched in sweat and no longer able to tell the difference between the whining fuel pump and the distant calls of summer cicadas. We caught a ride to town and bought a spare pump and spent the next 2 days troubleshooting and collecting our thoughts before getting back on the road. We knew that once we left here, there wouldn't be another safety net like it until we arrived in Montana. We weren't able to fix the issue with the pump, but knowing we had a swappable spare made the next several days a little less nerve-wracking. Hell, we even learned to live with the sound. Relief overtook us as the farms of Middle America melted away into the plains and grasslands of the West. To me, this felt like a homecoming, but for Aimee, it was the first time she'd ever laid eyes on such an expansive landscape. The rest of that night was a bit of a blur. At some point, we abandoned the van and took shelter with other travelers in a small visitor center nearby. The building was shaking so violently that water was sloshing out of the toilets. Then, as suddenly as it had hit, the storm was gone. The true extent of the damage wouldn't become clear until sunrise. We had gotten lucky. We didn't know that storm was coming, and if we hadn't pulled over to rest when we did, we would have been caught right in the middle of it. Seeing the 18-wheelers tossed aside like toy cars reminded us just how vulnerable we were, even with the relative fortitude of our van. We'd survived the journey's first real test, and with our nerves slightly shaken, we pushed onwards to Montana. When we arrived, southwest Montana was experiencing one of its worst heat waves in recent memory. My extended family had rented a place up north on Flathead Lake for a reunion, so we drove up to meet them and spent the next week lakeside doing what we could to beat the heat. So, we picked up some hitchhikers at the last campground. We now know there was two. We just thought there was one. It was over 100 degrees when we were driving, and one tried to make a run for it and bit the big one. Today we smelled something funny in the van. Turns out there was another one in there, stuck deep in our air vents. But we got it. It did not live to tell the tale. Take that, mice. So, it's sad, but it was us or them. Despite the debilitating temperatures, we knew we couldn't come this close to Glacier without making a few casts. We hiked to Avalanche Lake so Aimee could get her first shot at one of Montana's native cutthroats. Our original plan was to start the season on the Big Hole, but high temps and drought were bringing early closures to the river. Although typical later in the summer, this was by far the earliest I'd ever seen it. Under hoot owl regulation, fishing was still permitted in the early mornings, but we decided to give the fish a rest and skip over to Rock Creek, just east of Missoula, where flows were still cold and steady. Small but abundant fish we found there were more than consolation. In fact, the 5 or so days spent casting size 12 elk hair caddis to overzealous surface feeders was some of the most fun we'd had in years. Eventually, a few large storm systems moved in, and heavy rains, followed by cold fronts, temporarily lifted closures on the Big Hole, so we took our chance and headed south before it was too late. My Uncle Bob's family owns a small fishing cabin in the heart of the Big Hole River Valley, and were kind enough to let us stay there and fish for the next 2 weeks. Delicate presentations along the bank to large, sipping browns would prove to be a sort of boot camp for things to come. Having a home base gave us confidence to venture farther down forestry roads than ever before. During an excursion to rediscover a small stream where my grandfather had first taught me to fly fish, we found ourselves exploring several small roads that seemed to extend indefinitely into the mountains. Ghost towns and empty canyons we found in those hills were a stark contrast to the fishing pull-offs packed with trucks and trailers down below. It felt as if we'd stepped back in time. This was the Montana the frontiersmen had known, a vast and imposing landscape, both beautiful and treacherous. As was true of so many similar settlements, the mines here had dried out, and its people, in a display of impermanence, had saddled up their belongings and rode off in search of new fortunes, leaving everything but their clothes behind. The mountains themselves didn't seem to mind. Things here continued much as they always have. Quiet, except for the occasional passerby who might stop to admire the decaying structures that once stood proudly along the hillsides. presence here was also fleeting. And just like that, we were gone.
Well, guess we can rearrange the back of the... Yeah.
We just drove around with the parking brake on, and we thought the engine was on fire. And Amy's immediately clipping her nails.
They're too long.
That's how she reacts to a stressful situation. Our sights were set on Yellowstone. We had cleared the next month or so to explore its reaches and beyond with no set plan. We spent several days fishing our way in via the Gallatin River as it meanders through the canyon of its namesake range. The fishing and wildlife were incredible, but we didn't linger. We knew that it was just a fraction of things to come. Was considerably difficult. Sites are expensive and book up daily by sunrise. Getting to them in time and waking up at 4 a.m. and driving for an hour or more just to find out there's no availability. We didn't mind. We spent most nights just outside the park's perimeter at affordable sites with friendly hosts, eager to have the company of the park's spillover. Waking up early each morning and driving in as the sun rose over the country's most breathtaking and pristine wilderness hardly felt like a setback. Spent exploring the western region of the park, we headed south to the Tetons before looping our way back up into the east. So, the van's been burning about a quart every 1,000 miles. And we've driven many thousands of miles so far, so we have to constantly keep up. Our dipstick is supposed to come out of here, but somebody bent it around to come out here in the engine bay. So the only way to check our oil levels is to take absolutely everything out. Spending an extended period in the park during peak visitor months can start to play tricks on your mind. At times we felt connected, and at others, like imposters. It quickly became clear that we and everyone else around us were only experiencing a fraction of what the awe-inspiring and unforgiving landscape had to offer. Stray only a short way off the path, and you could be swallowed whole by its vastness. Find your way back, and you could be stuck in traffic. We needed a break.
Living large.
Flame broiled. There we go.
A short section of the Madison between Hebgen Dam and Quake Lake is known for producing particularly large and abundant fish. We spent a few days camped alongside this section, where I had spent countless evenings as a young boy casting oversized parachute atoms to unimpressed trout. Not much has changed over the years, but we were lucky enough to catch a few fish under the watchful eye of a mother osprey and her two fledglings. We headed north before the weekend crowds could run us out. It is July 28th, and last night it snowed. Up there, snow. We'd gotten a tip from an eccentric camp host just outside of Gardner, who smelled faintly of whiskey and spoke mostly in riddles. He drew us a crude map showing a few sites high in the mountains where he said we could find the best bear country you could drive a vehicle into. With nervous excitement, we decided to give it a shot. What we found in the mountains, however, was far from frightening. It was, in fact, a familiar and comforting reminder of home. A small creek paralleled the washboarded forestry road, which to this day we still aren't sure how we got the van up. 6 to 8 inch brookies, no doubt transplanted there over a half century ago in coffee cans, were thriving much like the small mountain streams back east. If it weren't for the occasional cutthroat and shifts spent watching for grizzlies, we might have forgotten where we were. We were lucky to have experienced that place, but when morning came, we packed up the van and headed back to lower altitudes. We were entering the Lamar. It was immediately clear that we'd be spending the rest of our time there. Home to the last great wild buffalo herd in the United States and one of its most prolific wolf packs, the valley is a direct lens into the western frontier's wild past. Beautiful, meandering streams, packed with the healthiest and most robust cutthroat population in the world, extended for miles in all directions. The Lamar Valley is by far the most popular destination in the park for anglers. Yet in a true testament to its vastness, we only had to hike a few miles to find ourselves completely alone, in utter silence with nothing but the prehistoric calls of sandhill cranes and the subtle sip of an 18-inch cutthroat dimpling the mirror-like surface in front of us. These moments, as it turns out, would cement themselves in our minds forever. When we look back on our time in the park, we won't remember it for its crowds of visitors, restaurants, gift shops, or traffic jams, but rather for its immense emptiness. It stands in stoic silence exactly as it has since the dawn of time. Though we left no trace on the landscape, its effect on us will be felt forever. We left the park from the northeast and headed for the Beartooth Pass. We had reservations about how the van would perform at altitudes over 10,000 feet. But to our relief, we coasted over just fine. As we neared the bottom of the descent, a heavy storm moved in and we pulled over to make camp for the night. The following morning, we continued to Absorki, where we accepted a gracious offer to stay in my aunt and uncle's home on the Stillwater.
So these are the worst directions.
No! No! Yeah!
It was now early August, and our funds were beginning to run low. We were thankful for the opportunity to settle down for a while and conserve our money for what was an inevitable return home.
Yes!
Just never pass up the $4 kite.
Late in the season, pressure on the river was dwindling. We spent the days exploring and the evenings casting dry flies to healthy browns and rainbows dancing on the surface in the dwindling sunlight. Each evening the sky seemed to blaze more intensely, as if to remind us that we were nearing the end of our journey. But we weren't finished just yet. I knew before we ever descended out of the Beartooths that we'd be back. I had plans to visit a lake in the high country I'd been told contained golden trout that have thrived there unadulterated since their unintentional transplant from the Sierra nearly a century ago.
Nervous and it smells different out here.
Reaching the lake would be hard. Accounts of the hike were discouraging, and those who'd made it warned that failure to pack light could be disastrous. We had 40 pounds of camera gear on top of already overloaded packs, and it took us nearly an entire day to gain some 4,000 feet over 6.5 miles.
Hey, bear!
We were absolutely exhausted, but could hardly contain our excitement. We'd come a long way from our little home in Massachusetts. Reaching this lake somehow seemed like the culmination of everything we'd experienced on our adventure thus far. We were there, alone, with one of the rarest species of trout in one of the most beautiful places we'd ever been. I took the opportunity while I had Aimee trapped on the top of a mountain to ask her to marry me. Sparing the sappy details, as a snowshoe hare and a lake full of fish are my witness, she said yes. And as our first act as a newly engaged couple, we spent the next day discovering that golden trout do, in fact, eagerly take dry flies. As August came to an end, we packed the van up one last time. Aimee was due to be a bridesmaid in her cousin's wedding a week later in Vermont, and we had just enough money left for the trip home. some ways, we'd hoped the adventure would last forever, but the reality of our daily responsibilities and obligations was slowly clawing its way back into our lives. Bullwinkle saw us home without incident. With a scary familiarity, we got jobs again and fell back into our old routines with family and friends. We thought often and longingly about the days of summer spent on outstretched roads searching around each corner for the next adventure. Most people would be satisfied to say they spent one entire summer doing exactly what they wanted and nothing else, even in the face of better judgment. But we're not like most people, and our adventure was just beginning.
He beat her every day, and still she never